Welcome to our optional background video here for Nanjing, the Burning City by Ethan Young. Alright, so another grammar mistake here. So there's going to be three parts to this video. Part one is some background and my experience with this book. Part two is just a real basic introduction to the Nanking Massacre. Part three is the book itself. Alright, part one. My experience with this book. So I've used this book with high school students as an independent project. I didn't have a full class set of these. I didn't have PDF copies. So what I did is I had two different classes take different graphic novels from East Asia, and they worked with the novels. They made Google Sites based on the books. They did video diaries and all sorts of other projects, made it kind of like a e-portfolio. And so I have used this with students in the past. But know that Nanking is a very powerful topic, and it can definitely ruffle some feathers. So if you're looking at using this book, make sure you get approval from admin. Probably even want to send emails, texts, phone calls, letters, whatever home, just to check with parents. If you do any research, a couple years ago, I was working with some middle schoolers. There were four of us, four English teachers. We were working with some middle schoolers, 8th graders, and it was a research project for a research paper for World War II. And everyone wanted to put a different topic into the hat, so the kids would have four choices for the research. One person wanted to do children who were affected by the Holocaust, and just look at children that were killed and displaced and all the other things that happened because of the Holocaust. Someone else wanted just the topic of the Holocaust. I forget what the third topic was. I think it was just like destruction and deaths of World War II. And then I threw in the topic of the Nanking Massacre. None of the other teachers had ever heard of Nanking. They didn't know anything about it, so they just said, okay, sure. And then two of the three other teachers, after they started doing, kids were doing research, came to me and said, I don't think Nanking's appropriate for kids to be doing research on. The Holocaust is fine, but this is inappropriate. So keep in mind this will does have some potential to ruffle some feathers. This book is based on research, and if you do have kids do research of their own to go with the book in place of different things to add more information, I would suggest maybe cherry picking some very specific sites for them to look at, because there is actual video footage out there. There are pictures out there that can be pretty shocking to look at. So keep that in mind. If you're going to have them do research, maybe find some sites and just say, these are the sites I want you to use. So keep in mind, Nanjing is a hot topic today. There are people in Japan who claim that this never happened. There are people in the government of Japan who claim that this never happened. So it does lead itself nicely to talk about things like fake news. Why would a culture deny this? Why would a government have a vested stake in saying something didn't happen? So there are a number of additional things you can do with this book besides just looking at the book. But looking at the book here, so this is a muted look at the Nanking Massacre. There are some parts that are a bit adult. You're not going to see any nudity, but there's going to be some cussing, and there's going to be suggested things happening or verbal things happening. So there are a few ways around that. One thing that I've done in the past with graphic novels, if they had a part or two that were questionable, I'd take a post-it note, put it over the frame, and if needed, I would write a little summary of what happened in the frame. So that's one way to do it. With a PDF or an electronic copy, a couple years ago I used an electronic copy of Barefoot Gen. There's a scene where his sister is topless, and so I put a black bar over her chest, because 8th grade boys are 8th grade boys. So there are ways you can edit things that don't detract from the story. But like I said, always get approval from admin before you do anything. Alright, this book does lend itself really well, because it's such a fast read. Because it's relatively short, it lends itself really well to go with other things. So maybe you're having kids read Mouse already, or you know that in another class they're reading Mouse. This can go along really well with that, lead to discussions, papers, compare, contrast, verbal topics, all sorts of things you can do. Maybe you want to look at a video representation of the Nanking Massacre. There's a lot of different ones out there. Netflix usually has one or two. Amazon Prime, you can get a bunch. The Flowers of War is just one of the examples I put down there because Christian Bale, real famous for playing Batman, so there's some recognition with the kids there. But keep in mind with videos, you definitely want to preview them because even the most muted ones tend to have some parts that you want to be careful with. Alright, so this works well with doing research, with looking at first-hand primary sources, the Diary of Rob or whatever, or even looking at more in-depth things like The Rape of Nanking, which is not written at a middle school or a high school level. It's written for adults, but taking some parts out of that, and then looking at here's the nonfiction one, here's historical fiction, what are the similarities, what are the differences. So there's a lot you can do with this book. Alright, quick overview of Nanking. Not meant to be exhaustive, just some real basics. So in 1930s, Japan starts invading China. We got a lot of different incidences that happen. We got the Mukden incident. We got the Marco Polo Bridge incident. We've got Japan staging the railroad, claiming that the Chinese blew up an incendiary device to damage the railroad as an excuse to invade Manchuria. Turns out it was really the Japanese military doing it, but it gave them the excuse. We've got the issue at the Marco Polo Bridge, which is what leads to the invasion of China proper, and that's in 1937. A few months later, we get the invasion of Nanking. There's a lot of controversy with the Nanking Massacre because, like I said, there are some people who claim it never happened. There's still a lot of animosity about the Nanking Massacre, a lot of hatred. There are restaurants in China that will not serve groups of people if there is a Japanese person in that group. I've had co-workers who were on trains and they tried to go to the beverage area of the train and were refused service because they were with a Japanese person. So there's still a lot of hatred over this. Alright, so the Nanking battle, there's not much dispute about the actual battle. So it all starts on December 9th. Japan's military is right outside the gates. Nanking had massive walls and gates. They had a mountain on one side. They were really well fortified and protected for a long time. There's a reason this was the capital. Unfortunately, those walls and everything, they were made for a very different style of warfare that didn't involve artillery shells, airplanes, things like that. So the Japanese military is camped outside. They send word inside saying surrender. Surrender doesn't really happen, but some of the Chinese people inside Nanking, they flee. Some stay to fight. Others, they ditch their military clothing and try and pass as regular people. Some of those because they're trying to escape. Some of those people did it to try and fight more of a guerrilla style fighting. So we got a lot of chaos in the Chinese army. The Japanese military enters the city on the 13th. They take control of the city more or less as soon as they enter. Alright, the occupation of Nanking. It'll last for 6 weeks. That part's not in dispute. Pretty much everything else on this PowerPoint slide here is in dispute. So there's a safety zone. In fact, there were a couple of places that were more or less safe harbors for Chinese people fleeing the city. Most of the people became refugees in their own city, trying to flee. We've got different people. We've got Nazis, Americans, all sorts of different people trying to save Chinese lives. We get a large amount of the city trying to hide into this very specific safety zone, but that didn't stop the Japanese military from going in and taking people out. Up to 4,000 of those people were actually killed. We have massive raping, massive pillaging, destruction, torture. At one point there was a running article in the Japanese newspapers about 2 Japanese soldiers who were doing a contest on who could cut off the most reach 100 heads cut off first. So these 2 military officers were out there with their katanas slicing off heads. So there's a lot of different stuff going on. If you look at the Chinese estimate, there's up to 300,000 people dead. The War Crimes Tribunal after the Nanking Massacre happened, after World War II was over, says between 100 200,000 dead. 20,000 women, according to the UN Tribunal, were raped, many of whom were killed after, some of those as young as little girls, even babies. According to China, up to 80,000 women and girls were raped, and many of which were killed after. Maybe even more. 1/3 of the city is destroyed just by fire. That's not counting the stuff that came from artillery shells or other things. Just unchecked pillaging. We don't even know how much pillaging there was. There are eyewitness reports of what happened. There are photographs, real photographs like the ones you can see down to your left here. There's actual video footage. There's all sorts of real accounts, diaries, you name it. Some of it from Americans who were there, some from Nazis who were there, Chinese, Japanese, you name it. Alright, so looking at this book specifically. So the characters in this book are fictional, especially the main character. But many of the characters in here are based on real people. The author did a lot of research. A lot of information in here is real. It's just the characters. Alright, it does begin in kind of the middle of things. It doesn't start with the beginning. It basically just looks at one day. It's muted. I said that before. It's definitely not gratuitous in showing what happened. A couple of post-it notes and you can easily cover up the parts that would be deemed inappropriate. But it does cover many of the atrocities that happened. It covers rape, albeit in a less of a blatant way. It does cover murder and humiliation. It does cover destruction, people acting like animals, but it doesn't cover everything that happened. It does have some useful things after the story. If you look at the pictures of the characters at the end, you will see the author's comments about why he made them look the way they did. This is quite interesting and unusual in the fact that not every graphic novel has things like this. So I'd really recommend looking at those. Some other things to look for. The author, Ethan Young, he does a really, really good job of a few things in here. One of it is faces and emotions. He does a phenomenal job of that. So really take some time to look at the faces, the emotions he's setting. Look at his use of color. Even though this whole thing is in black and white, he does a lot of grayscale, a lot of shading, a lot of black-white. Take a look at all that. Take a minute to digest it. Don't run through things very quickly. His use of angles can be really interesting. In fact, if you look at page 110, there's a really nice example of how he used angles. And one of the things that I really, really like about this book is his use of silence. There are going to be entire pages where there aren't any words. But that doesn't mean there's not a lot of story coming out. So when you see those pages, look very closely at the pictures. Take some time to digest them, because he does a phenomenal job of getting things across without words. Alright, if you have any questions, just ask. That was your basic introduction to the book and Nanking Massacre.